There once was a wealthy widow who lived alone in a large mansion at the edge of the bustling city with walls draped in golden tapestries and rooms lined with marble floors. Her name was Eleanor Rhodes, a woman whose fortune had grown through a business empire built by her late husband. Despite having everything one could possibly desire, Eleanor often sat in her vast drawing room, staring into the silence, wondering about the purpose of it all. For her days were lonely, her nights even more so. And her riches brought her no solace. In a house that echoed only her footsteps, Eleanor was known throughout the city as a woman of elegance, sophistication, and mystery. Her late husband, Thomas Rhodes, had founded an empire in construction and real estate, leaving her not just with enormous wealth, but also with a legacy to uphold. Eleanor, however, was no ordinary widow. She had an unshakable resolve and an astute business mind, one that few ever noticed because she rarely ventured out of her bubble. Every day, her house was meticulously cleaned by staff who were instructed to keep to their duties and little else. They were seen, but not heard, for Eleanor valued her solitude above all else. There was one among her staff who did stand out, however. His name was Marcus, the janitor. He had worked in her mansion for the past 6 years, a man of quiet demeanor, humble actions, and an uncanny knack for fixing anything that was broken. Marcus was a man of few words, tall and lean, with graying hair and calloused hands that told stories of a lifetime of hard work. Marcus was different from the others. He never hesitated to greet Eleanor when their paths crossed, even though most of the staff avoided looking her in the eye. He would offer a nod or a respectful "Good morning, Mum," his voice gentle yet sturdy. Eleanor often found herself thinking about the peculiar janitor and his unwavering sense of calm. Something about him seemed to carry the weight of a life that had not been easy. And yet here he was, steady as the tides. On a particular Tuesday morning, Eleanor sat in her office surrounded by piles of papers, financial statements, and documents outlining the affairs of her husband's empire. She had been receiving offers from partners, investors, and conglomerates eager to acquire pieces of the Rhodes business, but none of them felt right to her. It was as though everyone only wanted to feast on her legacy and tear it apart for their own gain. Eleanor found herself in a conundrum, one that neither her wealth nor her late husband's foresight could fix. That same afternoon, Marcus was fixing a broken chandelier in the hallway, his old toolbox rattling softly as he carefully worked. Eleanor stood nearby, observing him as she often did in these moments when no one else was around. She felt a peculiar sense of comfort. Watching Marcus, there was no pretension, no superficiality, just a man and his work, carried out with focus and skill. She cleared her throat to get his attention. Marcus turned to face her, wiping his hands on his faded overalls. "Yes, Mum," he said, with his usual calm tone. Eleanor paused for a moment, unsure why she had stopped to speak to him. Then, as if inspired by some invisible force, she asked Marcus, "What do you think of business?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Marcus blinked slowly, his expression unreadable. "Well, Mum, I am not much for suits and ledgers, but business is about building things and keeping them standing, I reckon." Eleanor tilted her head, intrigued by his response. "Building things and keeping them standing," she repeated thoughtfully. Marcus nodded, his eyes steady and clear. "If something's worth building, it's worth taking care of. Otherwise, it'll fall apart. That's how I see it, Mum." Eleanor considered his words, and something in them struck a chord. She glanced at the towering pile of papers on her desk, and then back at Marcus. "Tell me, Marcus," she said slowly, "would you be willing to join me tomorrow morning for a meeting?" Marcus raised an eyebrow clearly. "Surprised me, Mum. A meeting?" Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes, Marcus, a meeting." The next morning was unlike any other in Eleanor's mansion. Marcus arrived at her study freshly showered, his work overalls replaced by an ill-fitting suit Eleanor had sent for him. Though it clearly wasn't tailored, Marcus stood awkwardly in the room, shifting on his feet. While Eleanor sat at her massive oak desk, the sound of the clock ticking filled the air. Eleanor gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit, Marcus, please." He hesitated for a moment before lowering himself onto the leather chair, his posture stiff, his hands clasped together. Eleanor pushed a document toward him. "What do you see when you look at this?" Marcus stared down at the paper, which was a blueprint for a proposed project. Tall buildings, glass structures, ambitious designs. He squinted for a moment before responding. "Looks like they're trying to build something real shiny, Mum." Eleanor nodded, her expression unchanging. "Exactly, Marcus. It is shiny, but at what cost?" She tapped the paper with her finger. "They want to tear down land we own and replace it with these soulless structures just because they can. I ask myself constantly, this what Thomas would have wanted? Is this what I want?" She leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus' face. "I need an honest opinion, Marcus. And not from lawyers or businessmen who only care about numbers." Marcus scratched his chin as he examined the blueprint. "Well, there's nothing wrong with building something new. But not if it's got no purpose. Things like this, they take over everything and leave nothing behind. No room for people, no room for real life." His voice softened. "When I build things, even if it's fixing a floorboard or patching a roof, I think about who's going to stand there next, whose feet are going to walk across it. It's got to mean something. Otherwise, what's the point?" Eleanor stared at him, her hands folded neatly on the desk. His words swirled around her mind like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "You think about the people," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Mum. Always the people." Eleanor rose from her chair, walking slowly to the window, her gaze drifting out over the sprawling estate in the distance. The city skyline loomed, buildings stretching toward the heavens as if to compete for dominance. She turned back to Marcus. "I want you to come with me," she said suddenly. Marcus looked up, his brow furrowed. "Come with you where, Mum?" "To a meeting with the board," Eleanor said firmly. "They need to hear this from someone who understands what really matters." Marcus stared at her, his disbelief evident. "Mum, I'm just a janitor." Eleanor smiled, a real, genuine smile, one that had not graced her face in years. "No, Marcus, you're not just a janitor. You're someone who sees what others don't." The following afternoon, Eleanor and Marcus entered the grand boardroom, a place that felt more like a courtroom, with its heavy wooden table and towering leather chairs. The board members were already seated, men and women in expensive suits, their faces sharp with ambition. Eleanor took her seat at the head of the table. Marcus sat beside her, feeling completely out of place, his calloused hands resting uneasily in his lap. The murmurs in the room quieted as Eleanor spoke. "I have spent weeks considering your proposals," she said, her voice steady, her eyes piercing, "and I am troubled by the fact that none of you have considered the people who will be affected by these decisions." The room was silent, all eyes fixed on her. She gestured to Marcus. "Beside me is Marcus, someone who has worked in this house for years. He is not a businessman, he is not a lawyer, but he knows what it means to build and maintain something that matters. I think you all should listen to him." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor nodded encouragingly. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice low and hesitant at first. I don't know much about business or money, but I know about fixing things and keeping them." Standing, he paused, glancing at the blueprint laid out on the table. "Things like this, they look real nice, but what happens when you forget the people who've got to live in the shadow of it? What happens when you build so high you block out the sun?" There was a hush over the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus continued, finding his footing. "I think if you're going to build something, it ought to mean something. It ought to give back, not just take away. Because otherwise, it won't last." Eleanor watched the room, her eyes narrowing as the weight of Marcus's words settled over the group. One of the younger board members, finally, spoke, his voice uncertain. "Perhaps we should consider scaling back the project," another chimed in. "Yes, maybe include green spaces or community facilities." Eleanor smiled faintly as the conversation unfolded around her, slowly shifting in tone and purpose. As the meeting concluded, Marcus sat back in his chair, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from him. Eleanor turned to him, her expression soft. "Thank you, Marcus," she said quietly. "You did more today than you know." From that day forward, everything began to change. Eleanor found herself relying on Marcus, not just for his work around the mansion, but for his insight, his simplicity, and his honesty. Together, they began projects that focused on restoration rather than destruction, building things that mattered and ensuring they would stand for generations to come. Marcus was no longer just a janitor. He was a trusted advisor, a friend, and a symbol of what could be achieved when one chose to listen to the voices that often went unheard. Eleanor's house no longer echoed with loneliness, for laughter and conversation filled its halls. Marcus remained the same humble man he had always been, though his life, too, had changed for the better. He had found purpose in a place he never expected, and Eleanor had found the one thing her wealth could never buy: meaning.